Morning.
Good morning.
Trust everyone had a happy Thanksgiving. Gathering together with family, friends, and enemies. Like good Christians, probably all the same people. Anyway, and thanks to the youth group for doing the children's sermon. I love the chicken, and I guess I'm going to see the chicken again this Friday. Magical feast, correct? Awesome. Anyway, it's Advent, as Pastor has said, and as many of you know, this is the first Sunday of the church calendar. Advent itself is from the Latin adventus, it means coming. And it's actually a translation of the Greek parousia, which means presence or arrival. And so it's a time when we await the arrival of the Christ child. Now in our reading today, we have Paul writing to the people of Corinth. And their Advent, they already have the Christ child, as do we. So they're awaiting the second coming of Christ. And the question Paul is basically trying to ask, based on what the letters they've sent and the news he has heard from them, is how do you live together with healthy relationships as you await the coming of the Christ? But before I get to that, and because you have chosen healthy relationships, and because I am a man, and the last thing I want to discuss is healthy relationships, I'm going to go ahead and drop out on the whole thing and just go with the history, philosophy, and theology lesson. So, before we come back to Paul. What is the basis of these relationships that we have? Well, it's creation. And I want to talk a little bit about the very earliest creation stories. The very earliest creation stories we are aware of come from the land of Sumer, from the Sumerian civilization, circa 23rd century BC. So 5,000-6,000 years ago. And these Sumerians created lots of different creation stories. And we have dug up over the last 100 or so years little bits and pieces of them on clay tablets and clay cylinders. And they have names such as this one, called, that the scholars give it, the debate between sheep and grain. So at some point, 6,000 years ago, someone decided to write a creation story that involves a sheep having a debate with grain. Now, in this early creation story, the grain wins. Grain, of course, is associated with agriculture and associated with cities. And sheep, of course, are associated with nomads and those who live outside the cities. And since it was the elites in the cities that were writing it, of course, the grain wins. Of course, in the Bible, we have the opposite. Probably the closest connection is the story of Cain and Abel. Cain, who is an agriculturalist, he grows plants and vegetables. And Abel, who is a herder, grows sheep. Cain loses that debate. He loses by killing Abel, but he loses nonetheless. And so there's that connection. Most of these earliest creation stories are concerned primarily with the coming down of kingship from heaven to the kings of the ancient city-states of the time. Especially Babylon. Babylon is extremely important in ancient times. It's also concerned, these creation stories are also concerned very much with the building of cities and the proper maintenance of temples for the gods who guarantee the rule of the kings. And the last thing that they are mostly concerned with is a comfortable life for animals of all kinds. And so those are the basic ancient creation stories that we have from 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. Now the most famous creation story of all time, up until Genesis, is known as the Enuma Elish. And it's probably based on ancient Sumerian stories, but the copies that we have, the most complete copies, were dug up in the ruins of the Nineveh, in the palace of a king, the last great king of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, named Ashurbanipal. Excuse me. And they come from about the 7th to 6th centuries BC. Now this Enuma Elish goes all the way back probably to at least the 18th century BC. And it lasts for at least 1,000 years. So by the time you get Cyrus, who conquers the world around 536 BC or so, and basically puts in place the largest empire the world has ever seen. By the time of Cyrus, this Enuma Elish, this ancient creation story, is the creation story of the entire Middle East. The creation story for the Babylonians, for the Assyrians, for the Canaanites, and also a creation story that the nomads that we will come later to know as the ancient Israelites. Also for them as well. Now Cyrus, just to give you an idea of how how spread out this creation story would have been. Cyrus, when he came to power, had, at that time, the largest empire that the world had ever seen in terms of geography. But even more than that, he had the largest empire of all time in terms of the percentage of people that lived within his empire. At that time in the world, 44%, it's estimated that 44%, the vast majority of the people of Earth, lived in his empire. And that's the largest percentage any empire, any nation has ever had. And so, as you can tell, most of the world, the vast majority of the world, had this creation story as the way it thought about how things were supposed to be, what the status quo was, how things were arranged for creation. The Enuma Elish. It's called the Enuma Elish because that is what Enuma Elish means, the first line of the poem, which is when on high. It's kind of connected to their own first line of our poem, which we'll get to, Genesis 1, in the beginning. When on high means more or less the same thing. When on high in the realm of gods before anything was. This is what happened. Now, it's a confusing 1,000-line poem. So I'm going to simplify it like crazy. And it is still going to be confusing, trust me. But I want to give you just a kind of rundown of what this 1,000-line poem entails. And it's much more chaotic and confusing than even I'm going to make it clear. Now it says that when on high, before anything ever was, there was no gods. There was no gods because there was no names. And there was nothing because there was only Apsu and Tiamat. Apsu is male, and he basically stands for fresh water. And Tiamat is female, and she basically stands for oceanic or salt waters. She's also sometimes called the deep. And these two waters are mingled together in a kind of chaos. One is a god, one is a goddess. And now we both have names, and we have the beginning of creation. Tiamat, by the way, is also considered the goddess of chaos in ancient Sumerian theology. And I would just like you to know that one of the cats who owns us is named Tiamat, which gives you an idea of what goes on in our house. Anyway, Tiamat and Apsu, they're the only thing that is. And so from the commingling of this fresh water, this Apsu, and this oceanic salt water, the deep Tiamat, comes all the other gods. They're spontaneously birthed from these two things. And they're birthed inside Tiamat's body. Now, the first of these gods in Sumerian mythology is Enlil. Later on, he's called Ea. So we're going to go with Ea at this time. And he is basically the first of the gods. And he has a bunch of brothers and sisters that he created, and they all have to do with other things, and we won't even go into that. And so they all live together inside Tiamat's body. The thing is that some of the gods kick other of the gods off because they are noisy. In fact, they're so noisy within Tiamat's body that Apsu, their father, wants to kill them. Tiamat, because she is their mother, disagrees. And so she goes to Ea, their firstborn, and says, hey, Apsu is trying to kill you. So Ea, using magic, casts magic upon his father Apsu, puts him into a coma and slays him. And Apsu is never heard from again. Apsu never appears in the mythology ever again. Anyway, so he does that, and then Ea takes a wife, his sister goddess, Damkina, who herself is a mother goddess like Tiamat, and they give birth to more and more gods, and so there's more and more and more gods. He also has a son named Marduk, who becomes very important later. Marduk is very powerful, at least as powerful as Ea, and so his parents give him the wind to play with. And all is well until one day, all the other gods decide that this Marduk playing with all this wind is irritating, and they would just like it to stop. Now, for some reason, this causes them to go to Tiamat and say to Tiamat, listen, we want you to take revenge upon the gods that killed Apsu. The same gods that Tiamat warned Apsu was going to kill Apsu, so they killed Apsu. Now they want Tiamat to take revenge on these gods that killed Apsu. She's persuaded that that's a good idea. And so she creates 11 monsters to take on these other gods. And she lifts up her own husband, a god by the name of Kingu, and makes him her champion. Now the gods that she's trying to take revenge on, Ea and the others, the gods who killed Apsu, they can never find a way to defeat these monsters or these gods. Nobody dies per se. There's just this constant battling going on inside Tiamat's body. It's really upsetting everybody. And so finally, Marduk comes forth. And he says to his father and the other guys, he says, I'll tell you what, I will be your champion. And I will use my wind and my power. And I will slay these monsters and defeat Tiamat for you. As long as you make me your king, all powerful on you. The gods talk about it, they think about it, and they go, okay. And so he defeats Kingu, imprisons Kingu, and then challenges Tiamat to a fight one-on-one. He wins. He slays her, he slits her body in two, and he makes the sky out of half of her, and the waters below out of the other half of her, the ocean the other half of her. So now they're no longer in the body, and the world, the universe, has been created by the two halves of Tiamat's body. And Marduk, being all-powerful, of course, decides that the gods, those gods who sided with Tiamat, are made the slaves of the other gods, and they do those gods' bidding. And all is well. Until one day, the gods who have become the slaves start complaining about it. And so Marduk decides, fine. So he takes Kingu from his imprisonment, slays Kingu, executes him, and from Kingu's blood, he creates mankind. And mankind then are the slaves of all the gods. After that, Marduk then, Marduk then makes the calendar. He makes the planets, stars, the sun, and the moon. He makes plants and animals. And he populates this new universe he's made from the slain body of Tiamat. And finally, after all of that, a little something called the Tablet of Destinies. Whoever holds the Tablet of Destinies in this time on high becomes king of the gods, all-powerful king and ruler of all the gods and everything below them. And so he takes possession from his father Ea of the Tablet of Destinies. And then finally, all the gods rest. And they rest by descending to the temples that had been built for each of them in each of the cities, Marduk specifically to Babylon. And that is the Enuma Elish. And that is the basis of the way the people of that time ordered their world, ordered their relationships. Now some people say, some scholars say, well, this was the science of the time. Others say, no, it's not science, it's pure mythology. It's a little bit of both. It's basically cosmology. And whatever our worldview is, whatever our cosmology is the way we kind of order the world and our relationships within and among it. Mostly this Enuma Elish was about social, political, and ceremonial systems. Socially, it basically made human beings little more than slaves to the bidding of the god. So when you would go to do rituals or sacrifices to the gods, you're essentially feeding them. So everything you do is for the gods. Whatever you get, you get what's left over. The gods get all the good stuff. And that's basically how it works. Politically, it means that at the top there's Marduk, and at the bottom there's human slaves. And so it's a hierarchy, a vertical way of ordering your society. And this was also used at their New Year's, sort of like their Advent. They have their calendar. And rituals and ceremonies were associated with the reading and the enacting of this 1,000-line text about the creation of all that is. Jump forward 1,000 years, remembering that this is the story of creation for a couple thousand years in the Syrian world. Jump forward 1,000 years, and sometime between the years of about 722 BC, when Israel falls, and 586, when Babylonians destroy Judah, a priest or a group of priests writes these lines in the beginning. And those lines comprise the beginning of the first of our creation stories in the Bible. That's Genesis 1:1 to Genesis 2:4a. This is what probably, for its time, and even for our time, I think, one of the most radical documents ever written. As people of faith, and as people who read the Bible, we tend to be a little jaded in understanding that because we're so familiar with it. but at the time, it's one of the most radical things ever written. There are many connections between this text and the Enuma Elish. Another name for the Enuma Elish is the 7 tablets of creation. In our Genesis, there's 7 days. The Enuma Elish is written on 7 tablets. In our Genesis, the creation of the world actually takes 6 days, with the 7th for rest. In the Enuma Elish, the creation of the world takes 6 tablets, and the 7th describes the rest. Also in the Enuma Elish, the gods comprise 6 generations. There's 6 generations of gods from Apsu and Tiamat to Marduk, just as there's 6 days of creation. On day 1 in Genesis, there's the mingled waters, the chaos, the deep. And the Hebrew word for the deep is Tiom. It's linguistically related to Tiamat's name. Tiamat and Tiom are linguistically related, so there's that relation. So on day 1, there's this mingled waters of chaos in the deep, and God says, let there be light, and there is light. In tablet 1, in the day 1 of creation, in the Enuma Elish, it's that huge battle with the gods, and as they battle, they emit light. The Enuma Elish says. On day 2, the waters are separated, so that it becomes the waters above the sky and the waters below, the ocean. In tablet 2, during the battle, when Marduk wins, he splits Tiamat in 2. The sky above and the oceans below. On day 3, the oceans are gathered together so dry land appears. The third generation of gods in the story of the Enuma Elish, the Emu Elish, whatever. The third generation are the gods of silt and the gods of earth. And that is when they appear. Third generation, third day. On the 4th day, Marduk creates the sun, the moon, and the stars. It is the 4th generation of gods that are associated with the sun, the moon, and the stars. On the 5th day, God creates the fish and the birds to inhabit the skies above, the waters above, and the waters below. It is the 5th generation of gods that are associated with fish and birds, water and sky creatures. And on the 6th day, land animals and human beings are created by God. And it is the 6th generation of gods that are associated with land animals. And it is Marduk of the 6th generation of gods that create human beings. In our text, of course, God said, let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness. And let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God he created them, male and female he created them. Of course, Marduk slays the God and makes us out of that God's blood and casts us into slavery. And on day 7, of course, God rests and ordains the Sabbath. And in tablet 7, and in the 7th generation, Marduk and the other gods take their rest and are served by their human slaves. So there's a lot of connections, but as you can see, a lot of differences. The thing is, the writers of Genesis 1 didn't have any real problem with what we could call the science of it. The structure is the same. The basic chronology is the same. The basic order and the basic appearance of the different things we call creation is the same. But they have a real problem with the social and the political and the ceremonial things going on with it. In the Enuma Elish, the cosmos is eternal. And it begins in chaos, and the gods are created out of it. In Genesis 1, God is eternal and creates everything out of the cosmos. Excuse me. In the Enuma Elish, everything is chaotic, and I have only given you a taste here. There is 1,000 lines of this. Constant battle, constant blood, constant chaos. And of course, in Genesis 1, everything is peaceful and ordered. There's no battling, no violence, no blood is spilled. In the Enuma Elish, everything is almost accidental. Almost everything that happens is catalyzed or caused by God's complaining about something that they didn't think of beforehand. So it's accidental. In Genesis 1, it's all very intentional. God moves over the face of the waters, and he intentionally begins creation in an ordered, peaceful manner. In the Enuma Elish, as I said before, everything is created by violence. There is not a thing that is not created without a sword involved, without blood spilling. In Genesis 1, everything is created by the Word. No violence. In the Enuma Elish, it says over and over again that the God's intentions towards the other gods and towards humanity is evil. It actually says that over and over again, over those 1,000 lines. The gods are essentially evil. The reason we bow to them is because they're evil. We need to keep them happy. In Genesis 1, after each day God says, it was, and after the 6th day He says, very good. There's nothing evil in God's creation. There's nothing wrong with it. The Enuma Elish puts in place a hierarchical, dominating, vertical social and political system. It begins with Marduk at the top with his tablet of destinies that grants him power over everything. And he is in control of everything below him. And the people below him are in control of everything below them until we finally get down to the bottom, human beings, which are only there to serve the whims and the needs of these chaotic, evil, violent, accidental, chaotic gods. Genesis 1 is egalitarian. It's built on the idea of equality. And it's horizontal because everything is in its place. Nothing is more equal or less equal than any other. And everything works together. You notice in Genesis 1, it doesn't even say God is in charge. It doesn't say He has a temple. It doesn't say He needs to be worshipped. It doesn't say I am king. It doesn't say do as I say. It says I created this and this and this, and it's all good. And it's very, very different than the Enuma Elish. In the Enuma Elish, it's all slavery. Everything is the slave to something else. In Genesis 1, it's about dominion. That's a pesky little word in our English language, because when we think of dominion, we think exactly what I say about the Enuma Elish. We think of domination, control, power. But in God's world, dominion is intended to be about creation care. To have dominion over the earth and over the animals and over every living creepy thing, the intention is to be godlike in that dominion. And to be godlike is to be, as we know from Jesus Christ, a servant of all. Very different than the Enuma Elish. And finally, the entire story of the Enuma Elish, this creation, is built on ego and individualism. Because it is always gods vying to be the most powerful. And on earth, it's always kings vying to be the most powerful. And that's why we read about the Neo-Assyrian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, and the first Babylonian dynasty, and the Assyrian dynasty, and the Sumerians, and what have you. And they all are centered on trying to gain this power from Marduk. In fact, Enuma Elish, like I said, was normative in most of these cultures, and almost all of them wanted, at the end, to take Babylon, because that's where the tablet of destiny resided with Marduk. In fact, when Cyrus finally takes Babylon, there's a cylinder was written, and it says Marduk chose Cyrus. Cyrus isn't even Babylonian. But it's so important to have this tablet of destiny, to be in Marduk's back pocket, to have that power over all these slaves. So that's, and Genesis 1 is predicated not on any of that, but on community and individuality. The whole idea is we can't really be who we are without everything else. We are at the top only because we stand on the shoulders. And without that which came before us, we can't even exist. We can't even be the individuals we want to be. So I want you to keep that contrast in mind, because as we all know, in Genesis 2 through 4, that peaceful world, that ordered world, is broken. It's broken. The story of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is broken. The story of Cain and Abel is broken. And the rest of the Bible is about God's plan for reconstituting that first peaceful, egalitarian community, individuality, egalitarian, very good, by the word, intentional, ordered creation. Jump forward. About 500-600 years or so, you have John 1, and that's exactly what John 1 talks about. John 1 retells the story of Genesis with Christ as creator. And Christ as creator of a new people who will themselves be God's plan to bless the world that he created so long ago. It really emphasizes this in verses 12 and 13 of John 1, where he says, "But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God." Of blood is hamaton. And since Greek is always gendered, hamaton in Greek is a neuter word. It has no gender. The blood, no gender. And it says of the will of the flesh. In Greek, it's thelematos sarkos, and it's feminine. Finally, it says of the will of man, and the phrase is thelematos andros. Andros is, of course, masculine. And andros means not just man in general, but a individual man, male, an individual male. It's also a word that is used for husband and used for father. So in John, we have a man who says, your true identity isn't in your blood. It isn't in the will of your mother, the feminine, of the flesh. And it isn't in the will of your father. Or in the will of the emperor, who is the Father on earth. It is instead in the Father God. To all received him, that believe in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man. Some scholars think that this single man, this reference to Andros, can also be a reference to, later on in much of John's writings, the various powers that exist within the Jewish community at the time. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Zealots, the Essenes. Because each of them in their own way basically want their own will known in the world. The Pharisees are so hot to trot about making sure everyone's holy that they create so many rules that no one can possibly keep them. And so then they create even more rules to get around the rules they created. They create the same thing the early gods created, just chaos, Marduk. The Sadducees are concerned with rituals and belief. You must believe the right things. Only the first 5 books of our Bible, no other things. And you must have the right rituals. You must have the right coins. You must have the right sacrifices. You must wear the right things. Come on the right days. That kind of thing. And of course, the poorest of the poor especially cannot live up to this. The Zealots, they're all about power. They want to seize power from the powers that be. And yet the only thing that they end up giving victory to is violence itself. And the Essenes are so disgusted with the whole thing, they separate themselves entirely from the rest of the community. And in the end, the Essenes probably are the ones that disappeared first and most quickly. So these two stories are about human will and God's will and the difference between them. If you put in place man's will, the will of the flesh, the will of the blood, you almost always end up with political polarization. You end up with a rampant individualism where even the most ridiculous opinion could be considered valid just because you have it. I mean, just go on Facebook sometime and tell me I'm wrong. Not on my page, don't tell me. Which brings us back to Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. Now, Paul, this was one of his churches in the town of Corinth. And the problem was he had been there, and he had also heard news that other apostles had been there, especially one called Apollos. And you can tell from reading this letter that there's a problem in this community. They're not getting along. Something's not right. The rich are eating rich food and the best wine and taking the best seats at the table when communion comes. The poor don't get anything. That kind of thing. And so he's heard reports. And he hears things like the Corinthians, at least some of the people in this church, consider themselves wise. They consider themselves powerful, noble, rich, and kings. And so there's a group of them that think they're all of that in a bag of chips, and they place themselves above everyone else in the church. They've become Marduk. So Paul writes them back, and among many other things, he basically upholds himself as an example. Paradoxically. He calls himself a fool. He calls himself poor. He calls himself weak. And says that all of those things manifest and incarnate God in the world. And this is part of one of his responses to reading that MJ read, which goes, "But as it is, God arranged the members of the body, each one of them, as he chose. If all were a single member, where would the body be? As it is, there are many members, yet one body. The eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you, nor again the head to the feet, I have no need of you. On the contrary, members of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable, and those members of the body that we think less honorable we clothe with greater honor, and our less respectable members are treated with greater respect." We just read a quote yesterday from Neil deGrasse Tyson. He said he thought it was curious that we spend so much time honoring those who are successful and almost no time encouraging those who are not. That sounds like Paul. Sounds like something Paul would say. But God has so arranged the body, giving the greater honor to the inferior member, that there may be no dissension within the body. The members may have the same care for one another. And he says, if one member suffers, all suffer together with it. If one member is honored, all rejoice together with it. Now you are the body of Christ, and individually members of it. And he's harking back to that creation story, where we are, yes, individuals, but we are individuals, members of it. In another place he says, you are individually members one of another. You do not stand alone. You do not stand above. You do not stand apart. You stand with. That suffer together in the Greek is sympaski. That glorified or honored is doxa zeta. Another passage in Romans 8:17. The only other passage in which this idea of sympaska and doxa stand together, and all of Paul's writings say that you suffer together sympasko with Christ, and that you are glorified together syndoxa fomen with Christ. So why do we suffer together? We suffer together and with Christ. Whatever we are honored in together, whatever we do well together, we do together with Christ as Creator, as part of this egalitarian, honest, non-violent, horizontal, structured community that is meant to be blessed and a blessing. So in closing, I just want to say, if I choose to belong only to myself, if I choose to be only an individual made in my own image, the king of all I survey, the master of my very own sacred tablet of destiny, let's make a great video game. If I choose that, and if I'm ready to defend that possession at all costs for myself, then I stand alone in my suffering, and there will be no one to share my glory, and I cannot relate to any of you. But if we truly are made in the image of God, bound together by the Spirit from the very beginning, together with all creation, the cosmos, world, and community, then whatever suffering may come, we will endure it as one, and whatever glory may come, we will celebrate it as one. And as one who has suffered this year, I know that you are there. If we believe all that, then in and through the faith of Jesus Christ our Lord, we await as we await His coming, His birth, His parousia, His advent, well then we will find that we can relate with one another. That we are not merely blessed, but we're also blessed to be a blessing for all of us here together and everyone outside there. We are blessed to be a blessing, and we are citizens of the kingdom of God forever and ever. Amen.